Hello, everyone, and welcome to History Inscribed. Today we're talking about a burned county letter from 1858. And if you missed my last video explaining what a burned county is, it's basically a county that suffered extensive record loss for some reason, mostly due to courthouse fires, the courthouse burning down, as they often did in the 19th century and before. But it could also be due to war, could also be due to any natural disaster or reason why records were lost. When that happens, even a small, somewhat insignificant letter can be a more valuable primary source from that time period because the official records are gone in many cases. So we're going to analyze this letter, and you'll see why I think it's more interesting than just a few lines of text. Now, let's talk about the acquisition of this letter. I bought this from a volume seller for about $15, which is priced about right. I think with a little more research, could probably ask about $30 for it, but that's about it. It's a very narrow niche, someone who's going to be interested in a commercial letter from right before the Civil War in this specific region. So that being said, even though there's not much to talk about with acquisition or anything like that, or flipping this letter for a profit, it's still an interesting historical record, and we can use that to show you how to analyze a document that you might buy. Now, Burke County, as I said, along the Savannah River near Augusta, about 100 miles from the coast, is considered a burned county because it suffered courthouse fires in 1826 and 1856. And then Sherman's March to the Sea came through in 1864. And while they didn't burn the courthouse during that year, there was significant disruption, obviously, during that year and after. And they targeted surrounding plantations and so forth. So a lot of family records were also lost. There was a cavalry battle in Waynesboro, which is the county seat, in 1864, and that cleared the way for Sherman's armies to proceed downriver. So this letter survived because it was sent out of the county well before that happened. So we're at 1858. We're between the courthouse fire and the disruption of the Civil War. This letter was sent to a merchant in Savannah, and that's why it has survived so long. So let's read the letter. It says, Burke County, April the 13th, 1858, Georgia. Mr. J.G. Pringle, you will please send me 50 pounds of bacon shoulders, and I will be to Savannah the last of May with a lot of shingles, and pay you promptly, and send it by steamer Swan next trip, and oblige yours, Marion Holland. Okay, so we have a commercial transaction here, so let's analyze this a little bit. The crux of the letter confirms what we already know from any history book. This area before the Civil War was a resource-based economy, and here we have two people bartering with agricultural goods. Someone needs food for their workforce, and they're going to pay with shingles, which are cut pieces of wood, which was a commodity at the time. And you can see that there's a difference between when this letter is written and requesting the goods and when payment would be delivered. It would be over a month. So we know that a lot of business people relied on their reputation, and these two obviously had a good reputation to trust each other for their transaction. So this letter kind of punches above its weight, even as short as it is, because there are some specifics here. So we have a specific date, specific location, but we have two specific names too. We have J.G. Pringle of Savannah, Marion Holland of Burke County, and a big one, which is kind of cool, is the steamer Swan. So these are all things we can look up. We can look these up, and this will add historical provenance and a lot of interest to this document. And if you were ever to go and sell this, you could include your basic research, and that will interest people a little bit more, I think. So this is a good way to show how to do that. Okay, so let's go into some of the research for this letter. So basically, I'll show you the area we're talking about here. So Savannah's on the coast of Georgia down here, and this is the Savannah River. Presumably, Marion Holland was somewhere in this area near Waynesboro, but probably operating closer to the river where he could send goods from the steamer Swan up and down the river. Now, Burke County's background confirms what we already know. It says Burke County was one of Georgia's most agriculturally productive counties in the antebellum period. In 1860, it was the top producer of corn, third producer of sweet potatoes, and third producer of cotton, making its farms the most valuable in Georgia. So you can see why this was targeted during the war. It says 70.6% of Burke County's population in 1860 was enslaved. Only 9 of Georgia's 132 counties at the time had such a large proportion of enslaved people to white people. So this kind of really puts a damper on our letter, because it's almost certain that those 50 pounds of bacon shoulders were for a slave labor force cutting shingles in the swamps of Burke County, or at least in the forests, the pine forests of Burke County. So that would be fitting with, 50 pounds is enough to feed a large labor force for a week or two, or a few weeks probably. So that's something that really, when you handle these documents, you have to realize they do have a dark side to them many times. Okay. In another article on Burke County, it says, by the end of the 18th century, the accrual of larger tracts of land by planters and the employment of enslaved labor resulted in a plantation system that replaced the county's small farm economy, and Burke County became a prime cotton-producing area. However, many plantations did not survive the Civil War, and the economy, still dependent on the production of cotton, moved to a system of small farms using tenant labor. Later, these workers were forced to look for work in cities after being replaced by mechanized cotton pickers and row cultivators. So we can see that our letter from 1858 represents really the end of an era there. The plantation system was going to be disrupted, and it was not coming back, obviously, after the war. And even though the region remained agricultural in nature, it would have to shift to these small tenant farms. So we can see that, this letter represents really the last vestiges of this plantation system, linked by steamboats operating on the river to the city. Now, this is very cool. The steamer Swan is actually mentioned in the May 20th, 1858 Daily Morning News in Savannah, Georgia. And remember, the letter said on April 13th, I believe it was, that the bacon should be sent by steamer Swan, and then a lot of shingles would follow in May. Well, if we look down here in the shipping record, we can see the steamer Swan, Johnson, Augusta, with 463 bundles of shingles. So these are probably the exact shingles that were in our letter. being sent downriver as payment for the bacon. And Marion Holland may even have been on board, the writer of our letter. So this really, that's a really poignant verification of our letter, that the shipping record we were able to find, and it actually matches the letter that we have in our hand. Okay, and I also found an image of a Savannah River steamboat that would have looked much like the steamer Swan in 1850s. In the 1850s. So this is an example of a typical steamboat from that era. As you can see, not very big, basically just a platform with a deck on top and a place to basically store goods and for the short trip up and down the river. And these were the lifeblood of the antebellum economy in the region. The steamer Swan also, I found a note that it participated in the Confederate evacuation of Savannah. As Sherman's army approached, the civilians surrendered the city, but the Confederate army under General Hardee, they actually evacuated across the river and into South Carolina to keep fighting. And the steamer Swan that was mentioned in our letter was one of the vessels that transported the soldiers across the river. Okay, the individuals in the letter. John G. Pringle was easier to find than Marion Holland. The Pringle family was a prominent South Carolina Lowcountry family. I believe they were centered around Charleston. If you see, his birthplace was South Carolina in 1809. So he was relatively older. He was an older man at the time of our letter in 1858. He died in 1876 and was buried in Laurel Grove North, which was the wealthy cemetery, especially going into the Victorian area. It was considered anybody who was buried at Laurel Grove in Savannah. So we can see that John G. Pringle, Esquire, was a prominent businessman in Savannah, and he lived to 67. Here we have another letter that I found, an 1836 letter from written in Sylvania from M.M. Potter to J.G. Pringle. And this confirms that J.G. Pringle was operating in Savannah for a long time as a prominent businessman. It says, "I wish to get in with some good man of Savannah to do for him a merchandising business on commission. You have been recommended to me as a suitable man." So once again, J.G. Pringle was well established in Savannah as a businessman, and this was 20 years before the letter that we have. So he probably lived a very lucrative life within the city. Now moving on to Jacob Marion Holland. I cannot say for sure that this is the Marion Holland that signed our letter. I tend to think it is. The location and the age would match up with someone working in the shingle trade in Burke County. And it's totally plausible that he would use his middle name for business. In fact, in some of these other sources I found, the same person goes by Marion Holland. So I do think this is the person who wrote the letter. I'm not 100% sure. We could probably do more research if I had more time and try to narrow that down, but we can talk about this man and assume he is the person who wrote our letter. Jacob Marion Holland, born in 1833. He died in 1874, so he died young, but he did live through the Civil War. And here's his grave. It says, Private Company C, 32nd Georgia Infantry, Confederate States Army. And Company C does match up with being recruited from Burke County, Georgia. So even if this wasn't the Marion Holland that wrote the letter, it was most likely a relative, a close relative of his. The 32nd Georgia was Colonel Harrison's most experienced infantry unit. It was organized at Savannah by Harrison in May 1862. It contained men from Savannah in the counties of Washington, Burke, Effingham, and Screven. The regiment was engaged heavily during the siege of Charleston in 1863, particularly in the defense of Battery Wagner. That is the battle from the movie Glory at the end. There, the brigade was rushed to Morris Island, and at the end of the Union assault, surged over the southeast bastion, killing or capturing any Yankees who still remained. At Olustee, and that was a particularly fierce battle in Florida, west of Jacksonville, the 32nd was commanded by Major Washington T. Holland. So, was this a relative of Marion Holland? It's quite possible. The regiment flanked the Union right, and Colonel Harrison credited 2 companies from the 32nd with capturing 3 pieces of Union artillery. It suffered the highest loss of any Confederate unit, with an official casualty total of 15 killed and 149 wounded. After serving in Florida, the 32nd returned to the defenses around Charleston. The unit also participated in the Savannah campaign, including Honey Hill, before surrendering in North Carolina in 1865. So, if Marion Holland, who wrote our letter in 1858, was in this unit, at least for some of the time, he saw some fierce battles in the east, in the southeast, at Morris Island and also at Olustee. He could have been at any of those. And so that's a dark side to a seemingly simple letter. Just a few years after he was ordering bacon, he was going to be in one of the worst wars imaginable on this continent, if that is our man. Now, I did find a reference to Marion Holland in the marriage list for Burke County that survives. He married Lucia Bargeron on the 28th of March, 1861. So just a few years after our letter, if this is our Marion Holland, he got married on the eve of the Civil War. The Bargeron family was a wealthy family in Burke County, and so that was totally fitting with somebody who was marrying for perhaps not just love, but also for economic reasons. We can see that the Bargeron family here had, it was extensive. It had many branches and many children per family unit there. And then to see Louisa Bargeron Holland, if this was his wife, she was born in 1838 in Burke County. She lived a long time. She lived until 1916, so all the way till World War I, and died in Toombs County, Georgia, and this is her grave. Yes, and we can see here she was the wife of Marion Holland. Miss Louisa Holland, sister of Mr. G.W. Bargeron of Waynesboro, died at her home in Toombs County Tuesday last. She was a former resident of the 68th District and is known to many of the citizens of that section of Burke County, and the bereaved ones have the sympathy of many friends. And once again, this was just another source that confirms she married Jacob Marion Holland in 1861. She was 22. And Jacob was a little bit older. They had 6 children: Joseph Bartow Holland, George Washington Holland, and 4 other children. Okay, so there you have it. We've analyzed this letter, and I hope this was interesting. It shows you that burned counties can have a premium over counties where we have a lot of records from. And also that simple letters can contain a lot of information. look how much we were able to find with just this letter alone and some basic internet research skills. And if you wanted to dive deeper and go in person to libraries and research institutions, you could find a lot more, I think. And also, of course, you don't need a lot of money to start buying historical documents. Like I said, this was a $15 letter, and it could provide hours of research. It's interesting to certain people who are interested in this antebellum topic. So there's a lot of things you can do on a budget with historical documents that you can't do with other collectibles. So I think those were the main points I wanted to make here. I hope you enjoyed this. Please subscribe to my channel, History Inscribed, and we'll look at some more documents in the future. Thank you.